Have you ever wondered what happens when a president slaps tariffs on nearly every American product entering America? Well, we're about to find out. Trump's new Liberation Day tariffs are expected to add over $9,000 to the cost of building a typical home and potentially push thousands of dollars in extra cost onto everyday Americans. The stock market just had its worst quarter in 2.5 years, and now economists are divided on whether these tariffs will trigger a recession or actually force other countries to lower their trade barriers. And in the next 10 minutes, I'm going to break down exactly how these tariffs work, what they mean for inflation, and most importantly, how you could position your investments to avoid some of the potential fallout. Have you ever wondered what a 10% tax on everything coming into America actually means for your wallet? Let's break down what Trump just did on what he's calling Liberation Day. On April 2nd, 2025, Trump stood in the Rose Garden and made a declaration that will reshape America's entire trade relationship with the world. On April 2nd, 2025, Trump said this will forever be remembered as the day American industry was reborn, the day America's destiny was reclaimed, and the day that we began to make America wealthy again. Now, what exactly is this liberation that he speaks of? In simple terms, Trump has unveiled the most sweeping tariff plan in modern American history. He's implementing baseline 10% tariffs on virtually every single product entering the United States, regardless of which country it comes from. Now, this represents a fundamental shift in U.S. trade policy, like a shockwave rippling through the U.S. global economy. The baseline tariffs are set to kick in almost immediately, April 5th to be exact, but there's a second layer to this plan. You see, just 4 days later, on April 9th, what Trump calls reciprocal tariffs are going to take effect. And these additional tariffs aren't uniform, they're specifically calculated for each trading partner based on what Trump's team claims are unfair practices already being used against American goods. And what makes these tariffs particularly unique is how they were calculated, because according to senior administration officials, they account for a range of practices that were previously considered difficult to quantify, such as currency manipulation, value-added taxes, aka VAT, export subsidies, technical barriers, as well as agricultural constraints. And Trump's team determined these rates by examining the trade deficit with each country, treating that number as the sum total of all unfair trade practices. Now, according to Trump himself, the calculations only captured about half of what he called the cheating that his team identified, characterizing his approach as a kind reciprocal. And Trump is framing these trade deficits as a national emergency threatening American security as well as our way of life. And he pointed to American vulnerability, noting that the US can't produce enough antibiotics and imports virtually all computers, phones, and electronics. These tariffs are needed to rebuild our economy and to prevent cheating, is what he claims. Now, to implement these changes without congressional approval, the White House is relying on something called the International Emergency Economic Powers Act of 1977, giving the president authority during economic emergencies. And Trump has used this authority before to impose duties on countries like Canada, Mexico, as well as China. Now, this approach differs from other tariff measures. The 25% duties on automobiles rely on the Trade Expansion Act of 1962, specifically Section 232, which focuses on national security concerns. And the scale is unprecedented. These are essentially new taxes that are affecting roughly $3 trillion worth of imports annually, and this explains why markets have already begun reacting with significant volatility. The market reaction to these tariffs isn't just volatility, it's the worst quarter for the S&P 500 in 2.5 years. If you think your investment portfolio is safe from this trade upheaval, think again. The ripple effects could hit everything from your next car purchase to the renovation project that you've been planning for. And Trump's trillion-dollar revenue claim has economists sounding alarm bells on whether or not this is accurate. When the administration projects generating over $1 trillion from these tariffs, experts highlight a fundamental flaw, which is that consumers typically reduce spending on foreign goods as prices increase. This creates a potentially dangerous economic policy that could trigger decreased economic activity rather than the promised revenue windfall. And like ships in the same storm encountering different wave heights, the automotive industry demonstrates how unevenly these tariffs will impact companies within the same sector. General Motors remains particularly vulnerable, manufacturing only 45% of its vehicles domestically, while Ford stands in a stronger position with about 80% of its vehicles made in the USA. And this disparity creates dramatically different cost structures overnight, potentially reshaping competition in ways that could blindside unprepared investors. Now, the truth is that these impacts cascade down to consumers through a domino effect of price increases, because when manufacturers pay more for materials, they pass those costs along the supply chain until they reach your wallet. The National Association of Home Builders estimates that tariffs on steel, aluminum, lumber, and other building materials will add over $9,000 to a typical new home, which further strains the already broken housing affordability that many Americans are facing. Economic experts remain starkly divided about what happens next. Some predict that these tariffs will reignite inflation as high as 4 or 5%, while others warn of potential deflation if a severe recession follows. And this dramatic divergence in expert opinions signals that we're navigating uncharted economic waters with significant risks in multiple directions. History, however, offers some sobering context. The Smoot-Hawley Act of 1930 attempted similar dramatic tariff increases, ultimately deepening the Great Depression by collapsing global trade by nearly 70%. And while today's economic conditions differ, this historical parallel deserves serious investor consideration. The international response compounds the uncertainty because China, Japan, and South Korea have signed plans for joint retaliation, potentially triggering worldwide trade wars that could further destabilize markets. And for investors, this means that understanding sector exposure becomes crucial. Companies that are heavily dependent on imported materials face immediate margin pressure, and construction firms, electronics manufacturers, retailers, and food producers all sit squarely in the crosshairs of these tariffs. Knowing your portfolio's vulnerability to these sectors could determine whether you are able to weather this economic storm or take unnecessary damage. And even without direct investments in affected companies, your 401k and other accounts are likely to feel these effects through broader market volatilities as companies adjust to new cost structures as well as revised earning projections, which is creating precisely the kind of uncertainty that typically drives market turbulence. And behind all the market turmoil lurks a question that will directly impact your wallet. What happens when the institution responsible for your mortgage rate suddenly can't predict whether prices will rise or fall? The Federal Reserve, which had been confidently planning interest rate cuts throughout 2025, now finds itself in an economic chess match where the next move seems impossible. Just weeks ago, the path seemed clear. The Fed was set to gradually lower interest rates after years of keeping them elevated to fight inflation. Everyone from Wall Street analysts to home buyers are waiting for better mortgage rates, and we're counting on this roadmap. And then on Liberation Day came those reciprocal tariffs, and suddenly the economic landscape transformed overnight. The truth is, I don't envy Jerome Powell. The Fed's dilemma is unlike anything we've seen in recent years. On one hand, tariffs typically drive inflation higher because when import costs more, those price increases get passed along to consumers. And this inflationary pressure would normally push the Fed to keep rates elevated or even raise them further. But on the other hand, these aren't conventional tariffs we're dealing with. What makes this situation uniquely challenging is the design of Trump's Liberation Day tariffs. You see, they're explicitly crafted to pressure trading partners into reducing their own barriers to American goods. And if successful, they could theoretically lead to lower prices over time on almost everything. But that's a massive if, and the Fed can't base monetary policy on hope and speculation about diplomatic outcomes. The futures markets have already started pricing in this uncertainty. Just a month ago, investors were confident about multiple rate cuts throughout 2025. However, now those expectations have been dramatically shifted, with markets pricing in fewer cuts as traders recalibrate their outlook based on the tariffs' potential inflationary impact. And consider what happens if other countries respond with retaliatory measures, a scenario that seems increasingly likely. Global supply chains would face disruption on multiple fronts, potentially triggering a worldwide economic slowdown. And in that case, the Fed might be forced to cut rates regardless of inflation concerns simply to prevent a deeper recession. And adding another layer of complexity is the political dimension. The Senate is actively considering a resolution to block the Canadian tariffs, with a bipartisan coalition forming against aspects of the trade policy. This political pushback creates additional uncertainty for the Fed's decision-making process, because how can they forecast economic conditions when the tariff landscape might change through congressional action? For someone planning to buy a home or refinance in 2025, this uncertainty translates to real financial consequences, because the mortgage rate you might have been counting on could remain stubbornly high for months longer than previously anticipated, and auto loans, credit card rates, as well as business financing costs could all stay elevated while the Fed waits to see how the tariff situation unfolds. And we'll talk about how the Fed will impact all of this shortly, but before we do, if you're enjoying this content so far, please consider smashing that like button for the algorithm and subscribing to the channel, as it's a free way you can show support and it is much appreciated. It takes a lot of time and energy to put out content like this, and dropping this video as quickly as we did took a lot of moving pieces, and subscribing is a free way that you can show your support if you found this content helpful. The interconnectedness of the global economy makes this situation even more precarious because if trading partners respond with their own measures, we could see a cascade effect that triggers broader economic instability. As one domino falls, others follow, potentially forcing the Fed's hand regardless of their inflation concerns. And what's becoming increasingly clear is that the Fed will likely hit the pause button on their rate cut plans because they'll need time to reassess actual data on these tariffs' impact on prices and economic growth before making any moves. And this wait and see approach makes perfect sense from their perspective, but unfortunately it means potentially higher borrowing costs for consumers in the near term. The political dynamics are also worth closely watching here because the Senate's consideration of blocking Trump's Canadian tariffs shows the potential for political opposition to gain momentum. Because if Congress successfully limits some of the aspects of the tariff program, it could alter the economic equation the Fed is trying to solve. So let's break this down. What's the real game plan for navigating this new economic landscape? Let's be clear. These sweeping tariffs will fundamentally alter market dynamics across every sector. The smartest investors won't panic sell or make impulsive moves. They'll methodically analyze which industries might benefit from reduced foreign competition versus those facing serious import headwinds. Market volatility predicts unique opportunities for those who understand the underlying economic forces, and by staying informed about potential information, shifting global trade patterns, and possible retaliatory measures, you can position your portfolio strategically. And when others react emotionally, disciplined investors who've prepared for multiple scenarios will find ways to capitalize on these historic market shifts. But one thing is for sure, and that's if you're enjoying this content so far, please hit the like button for the algorithm and consider subscribing to the channel if you haven't done so already. It takes a lot of time and energy to put out content like this, and subscribing is a free way you can show your support, and it is much appreciated.